The boardroom smelled like expensive coffee and cheap betrayal. I should have seen it coming when Vara called the emergency meeting without telling me the agenda. Should have noticed how Sornell kept checking his phone, that smug little grin spreading across his face like oil on water. Keaton, we need to discuss your performance metrics, Vara announced, her voice carrying that particular ice-cold tone she reserved for quarterly disappointments and overpriced caterers. I glanced around the mahogany table. 12 board members, all suddenly fascinated by their tablets. Even Margaret Holbrook, who'd been my strongest supporter since the Denver acquisition, couldn't meet my eyes. My performance? I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice level. Revenues up 18%. Client retention hit 92%. The Meridian deal closed 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Sornell cleared his throat. Actually, Keaton, there have been some concerns about your strategic direction. This was Rich, Sornell Martinez, 28 years old, hired 6 months ago as an executive assistant, now lecturing me about strategy. The kid barely knew the difference between quarterly projections and quarterly reports. Concerns from whom? I asked. From me, Vara said. And from several board members who've expressed reservations about your recent decisions. I looked around the table again. Still no eye contact. These people had applauded my presentations for 3 years. They'd voted me chief operating officer unanimously. Now they sat there like mannequins in expensive suits. What specific decisions? I pressed. Vara exchanged a glance with Sornell. Something passed between them, some silent communication I wasn't privy to. That should have been my first real warning. The Henderson Project, Sornell said, consulting his tablet with theatrical precision. Budget overruns of 12%. Henderson came in under budget, I replied. Final costs were 8% below projection. The Morrison timeline. Morrison delivered 3 days early. Vara raised her hand, silencing us both. This isn't a debate, Keaton. The board has made its decision. The words hit me like a slap. Decision about what? Your position as COO is terminated, effective immediately. Sornell will assume your responsibilities while we search for a permanent replacement. The silence stretched like a taut wire. I could hear the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. Margaret Holbrook shifted in her chair, finally looking up with something that might have been guilt. You're firing me, I said. Not a question. We're restructuring, Vara corrected. Your severance package is generous. 3 months' salary, full benefits through the end of the year. I stood up slowly, my mind racing through the implications. 3 years of building this company from a mid-tier consulting firm into a regional powerhouse. 3 years of 60-hour weeks, missed dinners, canceled vacations. 3 years of marriage to a woman who apparently saw me as just another line item on her balance sheet. And you're promoting your secretary to replace me. Sornell has demonstrated exceptional insight into our operational needs, Vara said. Exceptional insight. Right. I'd seen Sornell's exceptional insight during his first week, when he'd suggested we diversify into cryptocurrency mining. I'd also seen his exceptional insight last month when he'd recommended we drop our 3 most profitable clients because their industry was aesthetically inconsistent with our brand vision. I'll need your access cards and company devices, Sornell said, producing a manila envelope from his briefcase. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. The envelope contained a termination letter, pre-signed and dated. They'd planned this. While I was presenting quarterly numbers to the Morrison Group yesterday, Vara and her boy Wonder were drafting my walking papers. One question, I said, looking directly at my wife. How long have you been planning this? She didn't answer. Didn't need to. The answer was written in Sornell's satisfied smirk, in the board's collective inability to look at me, in the way Vara's fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit I'd noticed whenever she was lying to investors. I picked up my folder and headed for the door. No dramatic speeches, no threats, no pleading. Just a quiet exit that probably disappointed everyone who'd expected fireworks. The elevator ride down felt eternal. 20 floors of corporate success stories lining the walls, including 3 photos featuring my projects. By tomorrow, those would probably be replaced with pictures of Sornell cutting ribbons and shaking hands with clients whose names he couldn't pronounce. The elevator stopped at the 15th floor. Lyra Ventrick stepped in. I'd met Lyra twice at industry conferences. Tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of presence that made other CEOs nervous. She ran Ventrick Solutions, our biggest competitor, and had a reputation for acquiring struggling companies at bargain prices. "Keaton Marin," she said, as if she hadn't expected to see me. "Leaving early today?" "Leaving permanently, actually." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting timing. I just heard about Ravil Marin's new product announcement." "New product?" "The Henderson Morrison Integration Platform. Very ambitious project." I stared at her. Henderson Morrison was my concept, my design, my 18 months of development work. I'd presented the preliminary framework to Vera last week, but we hadn't announced anything publicly. "When did you hear about this?" I asked. "This morning. Your your new COO, sent out a press release about an hour ago." The elevator reached the ground floor. As the doors opened, Lyra handed me a business card. "Trust me," she said quietly. "They will regret this." I walked through the lobby in a daze. The security guard who'd greeted me every morning for 3 years avoided eye contact. The receptionist who always asked about my weekend suddenly found her computer screen fascinating. Outside, the October air felt sharp against my face. I stood on the sidewalk, watching people hurry past with their important meetings and urgent deadlines, and tried to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed. Text message from Vera. "Please don't make this more difficult than necessary. Your personal items will be delivered tomorrow." More difficult than necessary, as if getting fired by your own wife in front of 12 witnesses was some kind of routine business transaction. I looked down at Lyra's business card. Heavy stock, embossed lettering. On the back, she'd written a phone number in blue ink. My second phone buzzed. The personal one Vera didn't monitor. Unknown number. "Mr. Marin? This is Jax Coleman. Lyra Ventrick suggested I give you a call." "I'm sorry, who?" "Private investigator. Licensed, bonded, very discreet. Ms. Ventrix thought you might need some information about your recent employment situation." I looked up at the Ravil Marin building, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun. Somewhere up there, Vera was probably celebrating with Sornell, toasting their successful coup with champagne I'd helped pay for. "What kind of information?" I asked. "The kind that explains why your wife fired you an hour after her boy toy sent out a press release claiming credit for your work." The pieces started falling into place. The Henderson Morrison platform wasn't just my concept, it was my complete strategic roadmap for the next 2 years. Market analysis, client targeting, implementation timeline, revenue projections. Everything Vara would need to position Ravil Marin as the dominant player in integrated business solutions. Everything she'd need, and everything she couldn't have developed without me. "Mr. Coleman," I said, "I think we should meet." Jax Coleman looked exactly like what you'd expect from a private investigator who advertised discretion guaranteed. Average height, forgettable face, clothes that suggested middle management rather than surveillance work. We met at a coffee shop 6 blocks from Ravil Marin, far enough to avoid accidental encounters with my former colleagues. "Lyra Ventrix has been watching your company for 8 months, he said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "She's particularly interested in your strategic planning process." I opened the folder. Inside were photographs, printed emails, and what looked like financial records. The top photo showed Vara and Sornell leaving a restaurant I didn't recognize, her hand on his arm in a way that suggested more than professional collaboration. "When was this taken?" 3 weeks ago, Thursday night around 10:30. According to the restaurant's reservation system, they had dinner for 2 hours. I flipped through the other photos. Vara and Sornell in her office after hours, standing closer than any CEO should stand to her secretary. Sornell's hand on her shoulder during what appeared to be a strategy meeting, the two of them sharing what looked like an intimate conversation in the parking garage. How long has this been going on? Hard to say exactly. First suspicious interaction I documented was 6 weeks ago, but the pattern suggests it started earlier. The emails were worse than the photos. Printed conversations between Vara and Sornell, discussing Keaton's resistance to necessary changes and the need for fresh leadership. One exchange, dated 5 days ago, included Sornell's suggestion that they accelerate the transition timeline. "Where did you get these?" "Trade secrets," Jack said. "But they're legally obtained, if that's your concern." I studied the financial records. Sornell's salary had increased twice in 6 months, jumping from $45,000 to $85,000. His expense account showed charges for restaurants, hotels, and what appeared to be weekend trips to places I'd never heard of. "Lyra thinks your wife has been planning this for months," Jax continued. "The Henderson-Morrison announcement wasn't opportunistic. It was calculated." "Why does Lyra care about my employment situation?" Jack smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. "Because your Henderson-Morrison platform isn't just a product concept. It's a complete market strategy that could put Roval Marin ahead of Ventrix Solutions for the next 5 years. And Lyra would prefer that not happen." I closed the folder, my mind working through the implications. Vara hadn't just fired me. She'd stolen my work and handed it to someone completely unqualified to execute it. Sornell might have exceptional insight into Vara's personal needs, but he couldn't manage a strategic initiative if his life depended on it. "What does Lyra want from me?" "Consultation," Jack said. "She's willing to pay very well for insights into Roval Marin's operational weaknesses." "You mean industrial espionage?" "I mean competitive intelligence. You're no longer bound by any employment agreements, and you certainly don't owe Vara any loyalty after what she did." My phone buzzed. Text from Vara. "Sornell will be handling the Morrison Group presentation next week. Please forward any relevant materials." The Morrison Group presentation. 6 months of preparation, relationship building, and strategic positioning. The contract that would establish Roval Marin as the premier consulting firm in the region. The deal I'd cultivated from initial contact to signed letter of intent. And now, Sornell was going to handle it. "What kind of consultation?" I asked. "Technical review of their strategic planning process, analysis of their competitive positioning, assessment of their leadership capabilities. In other words, help Lyra figure out how to destroy them. Help Lyra understand their vulnerabilities so she can compete more effectively." I thought about Vara's expression during the board meeting. The cold satisfaction when she'd announced my termination. The way she'd looked at Sornell like he was some kind of strategic genius instead of an overpaid secretary with delusions of competence. How much is Lyra willing to pay? $50,000 for a comprehensive analysis. Another $50,000 if her competitive response is successful. $100,000. More than my severance package, and enough to buy some time while I figured out my next move. "I'll need guarantees," I said. "Nothing illegal, nothing that could be traced back to me." Lyra operates with complete discretion. Her methods are aggressive, but always legal. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Vara. "Also need Henderson project files transferred to Sornell by end of business today." Henderson project files. 2 years of research, development, and strategic planning. My intellectual property, created on company time, but based on relationships and insights that belonged to me. "When does Lyra want to meet?" I asked. Jax checked his watch. "How about now? She's waiting in her car outside." Through the coffee shop window, I could see a black sedan parked across the street. Tinted windows, diplomatic plates, the kind of vehicle that suggested serious money and serious intentions. She was that confident I'd say yes? She was that confident you'd be angry enough to want revenge. Revenge. The word hung in the air like an invitation. I'd spent 3 years building Vera's company, supporting her ambitions, believing we were partners in something meaningful, and she'd thrown it all away for a secretary who couldn't spell strategic without spell check. Tell me something, Jax. In your professional opinion, how long will it take Sornell to destroy everything I built? Based on his qualifications and track record? 6 months, maybe less. And how long would it take Lyra to capitalize on that destruction? Considerably less than 6 months. I stood up, leaving the folder on the table. Let's go meet your boss. Lyra Ventrix's car was more like a mobile office. Leather seats, built-in desk, multiple screens displaying what appeared to be real-time market data. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of focused intensity that made successful entrepreneurs either very rich or very crazy. Keaton, she said, extending her hand. Thank you for considering my proposal. Jax says you've been watching Ravel Marin for 8 months. I've been watching you for 8 months. Your wife's company was only interesting because of your strategic initiatives. Direct and to the point. I appreciated that. What makes you think I can help you compete with them? Lyra handed me a tablet displaying a detailed organizational chart. Ravel Marin's structure, complete with reporting relationships, decision-making processes, and what appeared to be personality assessments for key personnel. Because you designed their entire operational framework, she said. You know every strength, every weakness, every point of failure in their system. And you want me to help you exploit those weaknesses. I want you to help me demonstrate that promoting an unqualified secretary to replace a strategic genius was the worst business decision your wife has ever made. The tablet showed Sornell's personnel file. Educational background. Bachelor's degree in communications from a mid-tier state school. Work experience. 2 years as an administrative assistant, 18 months in customer service, 6 months as Vara's executive secretary. Strategic planning experience, none. Leadership experience, none. Technical expertise, none. He's going to destroy everything, I said. Probably, but that could take months, and I'd prefer not to wait. I want to accelerate the process. How? Lyra smiled, and for the first time since leaving the boardroom, I felt like someone understood exactly what I was thinking. By giving him enough rope to hang himself, then making sure everyone's watching when he does it. Lyra's office occupied the entire top floor of the Ventrix building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. From her conference room, I could see the Ravel Marin building 6 blocks away, its glass facade gleaming in the morning sun like a monument to corporate arrogance. The Morrison Group presentation is scheduled for Thursday, Lyra said, spreading documents across the mahogany table. Sornell has 5 days to prepare for the most important pitch in your former company's history. I studied the materials she'd assembled. Morrison Group's corporate structure, financial statements, strategic priorities, and competitive challenges. Information that would have taken me weeks to compile, laid out like a battle plan. How did you get all this? Morrison Group has been considering a partnership with Ventrix Solutions for 6 months. We've done extensive due diligence on their operational needs. And you're willing to share that intelligence with me? I'm willing to share it with someone who understands how to use it effectively. The Morrison Group contract was worth $12 million over 3 years. More importantly, it would establish the winning firm as the preferred vendor for Morrison's entire network of subsidiary companies, another $40 million in potential revenue. What exactly do you want me to do? Lyra handed me a USB drive. Sornell will be desperate for insights into Morrison's decision-making process. He'll need background research, strategic analysis, competitive positioning, all the work you would have done if Vera hadn't fired you. And you're going to give it to him, indirectly, of course. The USB drive contained a complete strategic analysis of the Morrison Group opportunity. market research, competitive landscape, recommended positioning, even suggested presentation materials. Everything Sornell would need to deliver a compelling pitch. Everything except the most important details. The analysis is 90% accurate, Lyra explained. Morrison's priorities, budget constraints, timeline requirements, all correct. But the decision-making process is completely wrong. I opened the presentation file on my laptop. The strategic recommendations looked sophisticated and well-researched. The financial projections were compelling. The implementation timeline seemed reasonable. What's the flaw? Morrison Group makes vendor decisions through a committee process. 6 executives, each with veto power, each with different priorities. Your analysis assumes they're looking for the lowest cost solution. And they're not? They're looking for the most innovative solution. Cost is secondary to strategic differentiation. I scrolled through the presentation materials. The entire pitch was built around cost efficiency and operational optimization. Solid business principles, but exactly the wrong message for an audience that prioritized innovation over savings. Sornell will walk into that room and spend an hour explaining how Rovell Marin can do the job cheaper than anyone else, Lyra continued. Morrison's executives will smile politely and award the contract to whichever firm promises the most creative approach. Which would be Ventrix Solutions. Which would be whichever firm understands what Morrison actually wants. My phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Keaton, this is Sornell. Vara suggested I reach out about the Morrison presentation. Could use your insights if you're willing to help. Professional courtesy. Professional courtesy. From the man who'd just stolen my job and my strategic initiative. He's already panicking, I said, showing Lyra the message. Predictable. He knows he's unqualified, but he can't admit it without undermining Vara's decision to promote him. I typed a response. Happy to help. Let me put together some background materials. How do you want to deliver the intelligence? Lyra asked. Through a mutual contact. Someone Sornell trusts, but who won't be traced back to either of us. Do you have someone in mind? I thought about Margaret Holbrook, the board member who'd supported me for 3 years before abandoning me in yesterday's meeting. Margaret had always prided herself on being helpful, on facilitating collaboration between different departments. Margaret Holbrook. She'll want to help Sornell succeed, partly out of guilt for not defending me yesterday. And she won't question the source of your materials? She'll assume I'm being generous in defeat. Gracious exit, no hard feelings, all that corporate nonsense. Lyra smiled. I like your approach. Subtle, untraceable, and completely devastating. I spent the next 2 hours refining the strategic analysis, making sure every recommendation would lead Sornell toward the wrong conclusions. The research was impeccable, the logic was sound, and the final result would be a presentation that impressed everyone except the people who mattered. One more thing, Lyra said as I prepared to leave. Morrison Group's CEO, Patricia Morrison, has a particular pet peeve. She hates vendors who focus too heavily on cost savings. Why? Because she built her company by taking strategic risks, not by cutting expenses. She wants partners who understand that innovation requires investment. And our analysis recommends the exact opposite approach. Your analysis recommends exactly what Sornell wants to hear. That he can win the biggest contract in Rovell Marin's history by promising to do everything cheaper and faster than the competition. I pocketed the USB drive and headed for the elevator. 6 blocks away, Sornell was probably sitting in my former office, staring at his computer screen and wondering how he was going to prepare for a presentation that could make or break his entire career. By tomorrow, he'd have all the help he needed, and by Thursday, Vara would understand exactly what she'd lost when she decided to replace strategic expertise with personal favoritism. The elevator descended slowly, giving me time to think about what I was about to do. Sabotaging Sornell's presentation wouldn't just hurt him, it would damage Rovell Marin's reputation and potentially cost the company millions in lost revenue. But Vara had made her choice. She'd decided that loyalty mattered less than whatever Sornell offered her behind closed doors. She'd thrown away 3 years of partnership for 6 months of infatuation. Now, she was about to learn the difference between tactical success and strategic thinking. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Sornell. "Really appreciate this, Keaton. I know the transition has been difficult." Difficult. As if getting fired by your wife was some kind of minor inconvenience. I typed back, "No problem. We're all on the same team." Margaret Holbrook's office hadn't changed in 3 years. Same family photos, same motivational posters, same coffee mug collection that suggested either an obsessive personality or a complete lack of imagination. She looked up from her computer with the guilty expression I'd expected. "Keaton, I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after yesterday." "No hard feelings, Margaret. Business is business." She relaxed slightly, probably relieved that I wasn't going to make her explain why she'd voted to fire me after 3 years of supporting my initiatives. "What can I do for you?" I handed her the USB drive. Sornell asked for some background materials on the Morrison Group presentation. I put together a strategic analysis that might help him prepare. Margaret's face brightened. This was exactly the kind of collaborative gesture she loved. Former enemies working together for the good of the company. "That's very generous of you. Vara built a good team. I want to see Rovell Marin succeed regardless of my personal situation. I'll make sure Sornell gets this today." She paused, studying my expression. "Are you going to be all right? I know this transition has been sudden, like a heart attack or a car accident, something that happened without warning or explanation. I'll be fine. Already have some interesting opportunities developing." "That's wonderful. Your skills are certainly in demand." My skills. The same skills Vara had dismissed as inadequate 24 hours ago. I left Margaret's office and took the elevator down to the parking garage. My car was still in its assigned space. Space 247, reserved for the chief operating officer. By next week, that would probably be Sornell's space, assuming he survived the Morrison presentation. My phone rang as I reached the car. Jax Coleman. "Sornell just picked up your materials from Margaret Holbrook," he said. He looked very relieved. "You're watching him?" "Lyra wants real-time intelligence on Rovell Marin's preparation process. Sornell spent the morning Googling how to give effective business presentations." I started the car and pulled out of the garage. "What about Vara?" "She's been in meetings all day. Damage control, from what I can tell. Word is spreading about your departure and some clients are asking questions." That made sense. I'd been the primary contact for most of Rovell Marin's major accounts. Clients who'd worked with me for years would want to know why I was suddenly unavailable. "Which clients?" "Henderson Group called 3 times this morning. Morrison Group's procurement director sent an email asking about personnel changes affecting project continuity. Even some smaller accounts are expressing concerns." I drove through downtown traffic, thinking about the ripple effects of Vara's decision. Firing your COO might make sense from an internal perspective, but it raised serious questions about company stability from a client's point of view. "Has Vara responded to the client concerns?" "She sent out a company-wide email this afternoon. Strategic leadership transition to better serve our growing client base. Standard corporate speak." "And how are people responding?" "Mixed reactions. Some employees are confused, some are worried about their own job security. A few seem genuinely excited about Sornell's promotion." "Which employees are excited?" "Mostly the ones who never liked you." I pulled into a parking space outside a sandwich shop and checked my personal email. 17 messages from former colleagues, clients, and industry contacts, all asking the same basic question. What happened? The first message was from Patricia Morrison herself. "Keaton, heard about your departure from Rovell Marin. Hope everything is okay. Looking forward to working with your replacement on the upcoming presentation. Best regards, Patricia. Professional courtesy, but with an undertone of concern. Patricia Morrison hadn't built a successful company by ignoring personnel changes at her vendor firms. I typed a careful response. Thank you for reaching out. The transition is proceeding smoothly, and I'm confident Sornell will deliver an excellent presentation. He has access to all the strategic materials we discussed. All the strategic materials, including the comprehensive analysis that would lead him directly into disaster. My phone rang again. This time it was Vera. We need to talk, she said without preamble. About what? About the messages you've been sending to our clients. I haven't sent any messages to your clients. Patricia Morrison forwarded me your email. You're undermining Sornell's credibility before he's even had a chance to prove himself. I read my response again. Professional, supportive, completely appropriate. How exactly am I undermining him? By suggesting he needs access to your strategic materials, it implies he's not capable of developing his own analysis. He asked me for strategic materials. I'm confirming that he has them. You're making him look dependent on your input. The irony was perfect. Vara was angry that I'd helped Sornell, but she was also angry that my help made him look incompetent. What do you want me to do, Vara? I want you to stop interfering with company business. I want you to explain why you fired me without warning or justification. Silence. I could hear office noise in the background, phones ringing, conversations, the general bustle of a workplace that used to be mine. This isn't the time for that conversation, she said finally. When will be the time? I don't know. Maybe never. She hung up. I sat in my car, staring at the phone and trying to process the casual cruelty of that response. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of building a business together, dismissed with, maybe never. My phone buzzed with a text from Jax. Sornell just called an emergency meeting with the Morrison presentation team. He's panicking about something. I called him back immediately. What kind of emergency meeting? Full team briefing in conference room A, Sornell, 3 junior associates, and Margaret Holbrook. They've been in there for an hour. Any idea what they're discussing? From what I can see through the conference room windows, Sornell is doing most of the talking. Lots of gesturing, lots of note-taking by the associates. Is Vara involved? She walked by twice but didn't go in. Looked concerned. Sornell was probably realizing that preparing for the Morrison presentation required more than enthusiasm and good intentions. The strategic analysis I'd provided was comprehensive, but it was also complex. Understanding the recommendations would require expertise he didn't possess. Keep watching, I said. I want to know how long the meeting lasts and who looks frustrated when it ends. I drove home to the house Vera and I had shared for 2 years. Modern, expensive, carefully decorated to project success and sophistication. Now it felt like a museum of failed ambitions. The answering machine was blinking. 7 messages, all from reporters asking for comment about my departure from Roville Marin. Word was spreading faster than I'd expected. I poured a drink and sat in my home office, surrounded by awards and certificates from my corporate career. Employee of the Year, Strategic Excellence Award, Client Service Recognition. Meaningless trophies from a life that had just ended. My laptop chimed with an email from Lyra Ventrix. Keaton, Sornell's team meeting suggests he's struggling with the presentation materials. Morrison Group moved their decision timeline up by 2 days. The presentation is now scheduled for Tuesday morning. Thought you should know. L. Tuesday morning. That gave Sornell 3 days instead of 5 to prepare for the most important pitch of his career. 3 days to master strategic concepts he'd never studied, analyze market dynamics he didn't understand, and present solutions to problems he couldn't identify. 3 days to prove that Vara's faith in him was justified. I opened my laptop and began composing an email to Patricia Morrison. Just a brief note, expressing confidence in Sornell's capabilities and offering to answer any questions about the transition. Professional courtesy. Nothing more. But as I typed, I made sure to mention how excited I was to see Sornell's fresh perspective on the strategic challenges we'd discussed. Fresh perspective. The kind of language that would make Morrison wonder exactly how fresh and how inexperienced Rovell Marin's new leadership really was. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made downtown look deceptively clean and optimistic. I sat in a coffee shop across from the Morrison Group building, watching Sornell's team arrive for their presentation. 3 junior associates carrying identical briefcases, Margaret Holbrook checking her watch nervously, and Sornell himself, looking like a man walking to his own execution. My phone buzzed with updates from Jax, who was positioned in the Morrison Building's lobby. "Sornell just spilled coffee on his presentation folder," came the first text. "Margaret is trying to clean it up with napkins." "Team is arguing about something in the elevator," came the second. "They've been in conference room B for 20 minutes. No one looks happy." I ordered another coffee and opened my laptop. Lyra had given me access to a live feed from Morrison Group's internal security system. Completely legal, she assured me, since Morrison was considering a partnership with Ventrix Solutions and had granted them temporary network access for due diligence purposes. The conference room camera showed Patricia Morrison and 5 other executives seated around an oval table. Sornell stood at the front of the room, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation that looked exactly like the materials I'd provided through Margaret Holbrook. I couldn't hear the audio, but body language told the story. Morrison's executives looked politely bored. Sornell was sweating despite the air conditioning. Margaret Holbrook kept glancing at her notes as if searching for some way to salvage the situation. My phone rang. Lyra. "Are you watching this?" she asked. Front row seat to the disaster. "He's been talking for 30 minutes about cost optimization." Morrison stopped taking notes after the first slide. On screen, Sornell had moved to a detailed breakdown of potential savings through operational efficiency. Charts showing reduced overhead, streamlined processes, elimination of redundant services. Everything a cost-conscious client would want to hear. Everything Patricia Morrison hated. "How much longer is his presentation scheduled to run?" "Another 20 minutes, Lyra said, but Morrison just checked her watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. I watched Patricia Morrison lean back in her chair, arms crossed, the universal body language of someone who'd already made up her mind. The other executives were following her lead, shifting from polite attention to obvious disengagement. "Sornell has no idea he's losing them," I said. "He's about to find out." On screen, Patricia Morrison raised her hand, interrupting Sornell mid-sentence. She said something that made him stop talking and shuffle through his notes. Margaret Holbrook leaned forward, probably trying to offer support, but Morrison's attention had already shifted to the other executives. "She's ending the meeting," Lyra said. 20 minutes early. This is better than I hoped." I closed the laptop and walked outside. The Morrison Group building rose 30 stories above the street, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Somewhere inside, Sornell was discovering the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. My phone buzzed with a call from Margaret Holbrook. "Keaton, we need to talk." "How did the presentation go?" It was a disaster. Morrison asked questions Sornell couldn't answer. She seemed confused about our strategic approach. "What kind of questions?" "Innovation timeline, creative differentiation, strategic risk tolerance, basic concepts that should have been covered in the presentation. Basic concepts that were deliberately omitted from the materials I'd provided." "Where are you now?" "In the car with Sornell. He's not handling this well." I could hear voices in the background, one of them rising in pitch and volume. Sornell, probably demanding to know why the presentation materials hadn't prepared him for Morrison's questions. "Margaret, the analysis I gave you was based on my understanding of Morrison's priorities. Maybe Sornell interpreted the information differently. He followed your recommendations exactly. Cost optimization, operational efficiency, competitive pricing. Everything Morrison seemed to hate. I'm sorry it didn't work out. Keaton, I think there might have been a miscommunication somewhere. Could you review the materials again? Maybe we can salvage this somehow. Salvage. As if the Morrison contract was a sinking ship that could still be saved with the right navigation. I'll take a look, I said, but Morrison Group doesn't usually give second chances. I hung up and walked back to my car. The morning had gone exactly as planned, but I felt no satisfaction. Destroying Sornell's presentation was easy. He'd done most of the work himself simply by being unqualified for the job. My phone rang again. This time it was Vera. What did you do? She asked without preamble. Good morning to you too. The Morrison presentation was a complete failure. Sornell looked like an amateur. I'm sorry to hear that. You gave him the wrong information. I gave him the same analysis I would have used for my own presentation. That's impossible. You've never failed a presentation in 3 years. She was right, of course. I'd never failed because I'd never relied solely on research and analysis. Successful presentations required understanding the client's psychology, their unstated priorities, their decision-making process, information that couldn't be found in market reports or financial statements, information that Sornell didn't have and couldn't acquire in 3 days. Maybe Sornell needs more experience before handling major presentations, I suggested. Sornell is perfectly qualified for his position. Then maybe Morrison Group wasn't the right client for his first major pitch. Silence. I could hear office noise in the background, but Vara wasn't speaking. Where are you? I asked. In my office, trying to figure out how to explain this to the board. The board, 12 executives who'd voted to fire me and promote Sornell, now facing the consequences of their decision. Margaret Holbrook would probably be the first to suggest that maybe they'd acted too hastily. What's the next step? Damage control, client retention, making sure this doesn't affect our other accounts. What about Sornell? What about him? Is his position secure after this morning? Another pause. Longer this time. Sornell's position is not your concern. You're right. I'm just curious about how the board will react to losing a $12 million contract. We haven't lost anything yet. Morrison might reconsider if we adjust our approach. Patricia Morrison doesn't reconsider. She makes decisions and moves on. How would you know? Because I've been working with Morrison Group for 18 months. I understand how they think. You understand how they used to think. People change. Strategic priorities don't change that quickly. Vara hung up without responding. I sat in my car, thinking about the conversation. She was defending Sornell, but without much conviction. The confident CEO who'd fired me yesterday was starting to sound like someone who'd made a serious mistake. My phone buzzed with a text from Jax. Sornell just arrived back at Rovell Marin. Looks like he's been crying. The new chief operating officer, reduced to tears by his first major presentation. Another text. Vara called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. Margaret Holbrook looked pale when she got the message. An emergency board meeting. 24 hours after promoting Sornell, the board was being asked to explain why their new COO had just humiliated the company in front of its most important prospective client. I started the car and drove toward the Ventrix building. Lyra would want a full debrief on the morning's events, and I had plenty to report. But as I drove through downtown traffic, I found myself thinking about Sornell's tears. He was incompetent, arrogant, and probably sleeping with my wife, but he was also a 28-year-old kid who'd been set up to fail. Vara had put him in an impossible position, then blamed him when he couldn't perform miracles. Maybe that's what she deserved, but maybe Sornell deserved better. I pushed the thought away and focused on the road ahead. Sympathy was a luxury I couldn't afford, and Sornell had made his choices just like everyone else. Now he was going to live with the consequences. The emergency board meeting lasted 3 hours. I knew because Jax had positioned himself in the Rovell Marin lobby, watching executives arrive with grim expressions and leave looking even worse. Margaret Holbrook came out first, he reported over the phone. Looked like she'd been through a blender. Sornell emerged 20 minutes later carrying a box of personal items. They fired him? Appears so. Vara hasn't come out yet, but 2 other board members left shaking their heads. I was sitting in Lyra's office, watching the Ravil Marin building through her floor-to-ceiling windows. From 30 floors up, the corporate drama looked small and distant, just another business story playing out in glass towers across the city. Patricia Morrison called me an hour ago, Lyra said, hanging up her phone. Ventrix Solutions has been invited to present our Morrison Group proposal tomorrow morning. That was fast. Morrison doesn't waste time on vendors who can't deliver. Sornell's presentation convinced her that Ravil Marin isn't ready for a project of this scope. And you are? We've been ready for months. The only question was whether Morrison would give us the opportunity to prove it. My phone buzzed with a call from Margaret Holbrook. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message. Keaton, we need to talk urgently. There have been some developments regarding your departure from the company. Please call me as soon as possible. Developments. That could mean anything from a job offer to a lawsuit. Margaret Holbrook wants to talk, I told Lyra. About what? She didn't specify, but the board just fired Sornell, so they might be reconsidering their personnel decisions. Lyra leaned back in her chair, studying me with the calculating expression that had made her one of the most successful CEOs in the region. Are you interested in going back? To Ravil Marin, after yesterday? To your old position, your old salary, your old life? I thought about it. 24 hours ago, I would have said yes, without hesitation. Ravil Marin was my company, my strategic vision, my professional identity. Going back would mean vindication, validation, proof that Vara had made a terrible mistake. But 24 hours ago, I hadn't watched Sornell cry in a parking garage. I hadn't seen Vera's confidence crumble during a phone call. I hadn't spent 3 hours planning the systematic destruction of everything I'd helped build. I don't think that's an option anymore, I said. Because of what you've done, or because of what they've done? Both. Lyra nodded approvingly. Good, because I have a better offer. She handed me a contract folder, thick with legal documents and financial projections. Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, Ventrix Solutions. Base salary 20% higher than your Ravil Marin compensation, plus equity participation and performance bonuses. I opened the folder. The numbers were impressive, but the job description was even better. Complete authority over strategic planning, direct report to the CEO, leadership of a team that actually understood the difference between tactical execution and long-term vision. What about the Morrison Group contract? What about it? If I take this position, I'll be working on the same project I developed for Ravil Marin. You'll be working on a project you developed, period. The fact that your former employer stole your ideas and botched the execution doesn't give them ownership of your intellectual property. She was right, of course. The Henderson-Morrison integration platform was my concept, built on relationships and insights that belonged to me, regardless of which company name appeared on my business card. When do you need an answer? Before the Morrison presentation tomorrow. I want you in the room when we win the contract. My phone rang again. This time it was Vera. We need to meet, she said. Tonight. Just the 2 of us. About what? About fixing this mess. Which mess? The Morrison contract, Sornell's termination, or our marriage? All of it. I looked out at the city skyline, thinking about everything that had happened in the past 2 days. The boardroom humiliation, the strategic sabotage, the systematic dismantling of Sornell's career. None of it had been personal. It had all been business. But Vara's phone call felt personal. Where do you want to meet? Our house, 7 o'clock. It's your house now. It's still our house until we decide otherwise. She hung up before I could respond. I sat in Lyra's office, holding the Ventrix contract and thinking about the choice I was about to make. Interesting development? Lyra asked. Vara wants to meet tonight, probably to offer me my old job back. And I'm not sure it matters anymore. Because you've already decided to accept my offer? I looked at the contract again. Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. Authority to build something new instead of rebuilding something broken. A chance to work with people who valued expertise over personal relationships. I think I have. Lyra smiled. Excellent. But you should still meet with Vera tonight. Why? Because she's going to try to convince you that yesterday was a mistake, that Sornell was the problem, that everything can go back to the way it was. And you need to tell her that some mistakes can't be fixed. I signed the Ventrix contract and left Lyra's office with a sense of finality I hadn't expected. The elevator descended slowly, giving me time to think about what I was going to say to Vara in 3 hours. The conversation would be difficult but necessary. She'd fired me without explanation or justification, then watched her replacement destroy everything we'd built together. Now she wanted to pretend none of it had happened. But some betrayals couldn't be undone with apologies or job offers. Some mistakes were permanent. I drove home through rush-hour traffic, thinking about the house Vara and I had shared for 2 years. Tomorrow, it would just be a place I used to live. Tonight, it would be the setting for our final conversation as husband and wife. The Morrison Group presentation was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. By 10 o'clock, Ventrix Solutions would have won the biggest contract in the company's history. By noon, Vara would understand exactly what she'd lost when she chose Sornell over me. And by the end of the week, I'd be working for her biggest competitor, using my own strategic vision to ensure that Ravel Marin never recovered from the mistake she'd made in that boardroom. Some revenge was immediate and dramatic. Some revenge was patient and systematic. And some revenge was simply letting people live with the consequences of their own decisions.